I also want to make sure to thank Dr. McPherson for her invitation to come and speak. This is something that I'm very passionate about, very excited about, and I hope to get a little bit of excitement from you as well. To begin, I have two questions for you. The first is, what do you fear? And perhaps more important, why do you fear it? And to get things rolling, I want to watch a short video that some of you may have already seen. Okay, who's seen this video already? Oh, only one person?
I've never seen it.
You've never seen it. So it started making the rounds a couple weeks ago. So for those of you who are interested, a gray squirrel found its way into this man's home office as a rather unwelcome guest. Okay, now I absolutely love this video, and it's really profoundly relevant to our discussion today. This man has actually had other encounters with squirrels, and they're not all in his home office. His wife has shared other encounters, outdoor encounters, with nearly identical results. Okay? So what we have here is an excellent example of biophobia, or an intense fear or aversion to some aspect of nature, okay, which normally manifests as an intense desire to affiliate with technology and other human artifacts, instead of with animals, landscapes, and other elements of the natural world. So in this case, this man in his home office, in his controlled space, is very calm until it's penetrated by some element of nature, in this case, a gray squirrel. And I think we'd all agree that with amusing results, okay? Biophobia, or fear of nature, has become so incredibly common that most people don't even associate their fear of some element of nature with the word phobia, okay? Now, there are a number of subcategories of biophobia which are more familiar. So we have arachnophobia, which is of course a fear of spiders. Okay, and then we have moosophobia, which as we all know is a fear of moose. No, I'm just kidding. So moosophobia is a fear of rodents. Then you have ophidiophobia, fear of snakes. Galeophobia, fear of sharks. Any of these sounding familiar? Arachnophobia, fear of bears. Lupophobia, fear of wolves. And yes, sciurophobia, for a fear of squirrels. And no, I didn't know such a thing existed before I watched this video of this guy. So, would you believe me if I told you this man's response, in addition to being entirely unnecessary, would actually only make matters worse if he were to encounter, say, a grizzly bear instead of a squirrel? You guys believe that? Okay. So, for some of you it may be hard to believe, but it is very much true. And to illustrate, I'd like to tell you an experience that my wife and I had in 2015. We were in Yellowstone National Park. This was taken prior. Visibility was very low, very poor, because it was after sunset. It was made worse by the fact that we were in a tightly packed lodgepole pine forest. Okay? As we were walking along, we came into a small opening where we saw something moving a mere 30 feet away from us. It didn't take long to recognize the shape moving in the darkness as a grizzly bear on an elk carcass.
Oh, bad.
It's really the primal experience. I can still hear that bear gnawing on the elk carcass. I can still see its silhouette with its prominent shoulder hump and its grizzled hair in the low light. And shortly after we encountered it, that's when it happened. The bear stopped, looked at us, huffed, and charged, eating both my wife and I alive. Okay. So obviously there's one glaring inaccuracy in my story. My wife and I absolutely did encounter a grizzly bear, exactly like I told you, at 30 feet. But the bear didn't even acknowledge our existence, nor did we give it time to do so, choosing to quietly and immediately leave the area, bear spray in hand, in case the bear's behavior changed, which at such a close range was a distinct possibility. Would any of you like to see the pictures or footage I captured of that encounter?
Yeah.
I thought probably a few of you. Here they are. This is every photo and every video that I captured of that bear that night. Okay? You might have guessed I did not even attempt to capture a picture or a video of that bear, because doing so would have been extremely foolish, especially because the closer you are to a bear, the more likely that bear is to charge or attack. And my wife and I were extremely close. Now, we were also fortunate. For one, we weren't alone. There were actually a few other people nearby. And that's always a good thing to have when you're near a bear, okay? Number two, our car wasn't that far, okay? We were very close to our car. We were able to get there pretty quickly. And number three, and most importantly, we had prepared for just such an encounter. Extensive study of animal attacks, animal behavior, extensive interviews and correspondence with some of the world's leading bear biologists and wildlife managers, mixed with my own personal experience, have taught me a number of remarkable truths and important truths about animals like bears and why people fear them so much. And the number one reason is that bears, for the overwhelming majority of us, just never enter our consciousness. They simply are not part of our daily life. And so when we do hear about them, they are normally perceived as a threat to us. Now, ask yourself, when was the last time you were listening to a news report and the anchor said, "This just in, Chuck, I'm being told that hikers in Yellowstone National Park have stumbled upon a grizzly bear," which immediately responded by ignoring them. Or I'm being told that hundreds of millions of people recreate in bear habitat every year without being attacked. The truth is, now, I don't want to be flippant. It's absolutely important and critically important that we know about bear attacks and that we learn from them so we can keep people safe. Okay, but pretty much every bear attack that I've studied could have been either prevented or the consequences far less severe had people behaved just a little differently. Okay? The truth is that surprisingly few people seem to be taking the time to properly educate themselves on how to recreate safely in the outdoors. Which is kind of ironic, considering the emphasis that our society places on wild animal attacks, right? And the popularity of spending time outdoors. You would think that people would really thoroughly educate themselves. And I'm sure in truth that a lot of people have attempted to educate themselves on how to travel and recreate safely in the outdoors, but have just fallen prey to misinformation, which quite honestly is everywhere these days. And that's especially true in the social media age. So here in the United States, just in the last month, while I was preparing to talk today, there have been at least five bear attacks, many of them gaining national attention. One in particular, because one of the parties got into an extremely ill-advised fistfight with a grizzly bear. Have you guys heard about this? All right, so the individual in question, his name's Kendall Cummings. He stated this in an interview with Washington Post. "Before this attack, I had thought that I could take on a bear easily. Now I know that a bear is pretty legit. They are tougher, stronger, and bigger than I thought. It's not so easy." Now, I came across that and it reminded me of a survey that I read a number of years ago, where 6% of respondents said that they felt that they could beat up a grizzly bear. So the thing is, with black bears, people do intimidate black bears with some frequency. There have been a number of cases already this year where that's happened. But grizzly bears are a very different animal, all right? So the Washington Post, in reporting about Kendall's fist fight with a grizzly bear, falsely reported that he won his fight with the grizzly bear.
Well, he didn't die.
He didn't die. He did survive, which is definitely a win. But as far as the match goes, he did not win. He didn't even come close to winning. Okay? Now, do you remember how I told you with the man and the squirrel that screaming and swinging hysterically at a grizzly bear would only make the situation worse? Kendall Cummings' experience is proof of that concept. Now, I am deeply relieved that Kendall survived along with all of his teammates. There were 4 of them up in Wyoming. 2 of them were attacked. And I wish them the very best. Their experience is not typical. It's an extreme exception to the rule, made worse by poor decisions. Now, since October, I've actually had a number of bear encounters of my own. Okay? All of them peaceful and awe-inspiring. Including an encounter with a mother grizzly and her cub. The main point that I'm hoping to make today is that not only is it possible to share space with wild animals like bears, but that despite the overblown hysteria bears, like other wild animals, are actually mostly peaceful creatures. We'll take these two as an example, okay? And they don't look all that peaceful right now. I stood across a river and watched these two bears for 30 hours over 2 days. And while they did come to blows for approximately 10 seconds, the vast majority of that time was spent lying down and relaxing in the shade, and circling each other and evaluating the risk and benefit of a conflict. Now, I'd really like to hear you guys' thoughts on this. Why do you think that wild animals would choose to avoid conflict? Did these two take a pledge in the Cub Scouts and say that they wanted to be peaceful? Or are they concerned about their public image? Is there a benefit to being mostly peaceful? Yes.
Because any injuries that they sustain can be with them for life. They don't have medical care like we do.
Yeah. In a world without healthcare, without licensed medical professionals, without antibiotics, relatively minor injuries can spell disaster out in the wild.
Also, it's a waste of calories to fight.
It is also a waste of calories. Especially these two, they were preparing for hibernation.
Yeah,
And calories really are life itself. Okay, so wild animals do not grow old if they are overly aggressive. They are naturally very cautious and fearful. It's a survival mechanism. Fear helps them survive in the wild. Everything wild animals do is the result of a risk-benefit equation. And like I said, wild animals are generally very, very risk averse. However, and this is important that we talk about, if an animal feels threatened, classic case would be a mother bear and her cub, or if they are sick or injured, or if they've been habituated to people or human food, they can and more often do behave aggressively. And that is why the cardinal rule of wildlife encounters is back up and give them space. Okay? Now I would like you guys to write this down. And I invite you to underline it, and then I invite you to highlight it. And then, just so that you make sure to remember it, draw a rainbow over it. And then draw a bear riding a unicorn over the rainbow. Just so that you guys know to always back up and give wild animals the space that they need. Given the space that they need, almost all wild animals will choose to avoid conflict or move away. Now, just know that this also varies from animal type to animal type, okay? So for animals like bears and wolves, give them 100 yards whenever possible, all right? And that's year-round. Now, for other large animals, 25 yards is a pretty good ruler. However, if they have cubs or young with them, or it's mating season, back up and give them a little bit more space, okay? Probably the most important thing to do is to educate yourself on how to react if you do come across an animal out in the wild, so that you don't inadvertently make the situation worse. And I really wish that we had a little bit more time to talk about that. I do talk about it fairly extensively on my YouTube channel, okay? If you guys are interested, definitely go check it out. There's lots of stuff there. I want to go over some numbers here from what's called the Interagency Grizzly Report. Now, this report is a collaboration between the Park Service, the Forest Service, the Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as various state and tribal agencies that manage grizzly bear habitat. In approximately 30 years, they have documented over 6,500 encounters between humans and grizzly bears in Yellowstone. In 58% of those encounters, the bear exhibited neutral behavior, like my experiences. The bear didn't even acknowledge the presence of people. In 34% of those encounters, the bear simply fled. In 3% of the encounters, the bear exhibited curiosity. In 1% of those encounters, the bear exhibited warning behavior, which is typically growling or huffing or popping of jaws. In 4%, the bear showed aggression, but did not make contact. Who can tell me what this is called, typically? Anybody familiar with the term bluff charge?
Yeah, it was a false charge.
False charge, bluff charge. That actually is fairly common. And that means that in less than 1% of those encounters, less than 1%, the grizzly bear actually attacked. But that less than 1% is pretty much all we ever hear about. Would you guys disagree with that? And that carries over into our social perception and our culture and our entertainment. Anybody here familiar with Jim Gaffigan? Okay. He has a comedy bit that he does now and again that probably seemed fairly familiar to the story that I told you guys earlier. All right? So we'll watch a little bit of that. Unfortunately, we can't watch the whole thing.
We're walking backwards slowly to nothing. It probably looked like we were teasing the bear, like, come and get it, Mr. Bear. And before you knew it, the bear was upon us, and he killed us, and we died. No, what really happened is at one point the tour guide pulled out this thing. It looked like a pen. I was like, great, he's gonna ask for the bear's autograph. When he squeezed it and this tiny fireball went out towards the bear. The fireball bounced off the bear stopped, and then just ran the other way like it forgot something at home. And that's a true story. Well, most of that's true. Well, it's all true, except there was no bear.
So he does go on and he says, I'm just kidding, there was a bear. But then he continues and confesses, you know, I do sometimes lie up here. As it turns out, lies, or perhaps more politely stated, fables, are for most people more engaging and more entertaining than reality. And when it comes to our perceptions of the natural world, we have mountains of fables to contend with. Okay? Now, you guys might be saying, well, yeah, Mike, those are all just movies. And that's true. And I think that most people, when sufficiently informed and with some effort, can distinguish between truth and fable, or reality and fable. However, there is another power, a sometimes spoken but mostly silent power, that is also feeding our unjustified fears of nature. There is a clip from the old-timey Candid Camera TV show that I think can help us illustrate this unseen power pretty well.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with a white shirt, the lady with a trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear, and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. See if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. And now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Sometimes I feel bad for that poor kid at the end. No words are ever spoken by anybody in the elevator, but nobody would deny that there is a powerful and covert influence at work here. Fear is a very, very normal and valuable emotion. It does serve a purpose, but it's also mostly expressed through social conditioning and social conformity. Now, I hope that doesn't surprise you. We are extremely social creatures. Humanity's success is directly related to our patterns of forming communities and acting and behaving in unison. Okay, it's how we learn what's safe, it's how we build cities, it's how we learn what is socially acceptable behavior. And it's particularly true in the modern age of social media, which has become a dominant influence in our perception of the world. Now, whether we realize it or not, or whether we accept it or not, each of us is hardwired to duplicate our community's response to circumstances. And that includes, and that's even responses that are not rational. Irrational social conformity also manifests in what we fear. Time and time again, in study after study, we're learning that fear, disgust, and anxiety are also socially acquired emotions. And responses, that's particularly true of our responses to elements of the natural world. It's part of the reason why I wrote this article about a year ago, where I discussed how parents are passing on their perceptions of nature to their children. Okay? And as humanity and as society drifts further and further away from nature, our fear of nature is growing in some cases. Now, I'm going to pick on my mom for a second. It's kind of okay because she's not here.
She'll love you anyway.
She will love me anyway, so that's why it's okay. She's quite afraid of snakes, and she admits this, okay? And despite, despite encountering numerous snakes in her life, including a couple of rattlesnakes earlier this year on a hike, no snake has ever harmed or ever even attempted to harm her. The factual truth is that snakes just want to be left alone. They do not have any kind of evil inclination towards harming human beings. When bites do occur, they're almost always because the snake is being harassed or handled. All right? So if my mom isn't out there harassing and handling snakes, then why is she afraid of them? A couple of reasons. For one, some people might argue, well, some snakes are venomous, and that's true. Some snakes have venom that is potentially very harmful to human beings. However, it's only ever used as a last defensive resort. All right? And actually, snake venom is a horrible defense mechanism. Fear typically comes from things that we don't understand and that we can't control. And that certainly applies to the natural world. So when we're children, we fear all kinds of things. We fear the dark. Perhaps we fear riding our bike without our training wheels. Okay? My 2-year-old son is just barely getting over his deathly fear of our vacuum cleaner.
Oh.
And my other son is terrified of our neighbor's dog that's about this big and looks like a mop-hair muppet. Okay? But he's terrified. Now, things that are new and unfamiliar can be frightening. Children experience it, adults also experience it. But more than those arguments, my mom has also been influenced by a culture that largely fears and reviles snakes, in some cases as the embodiment of evil. Now, movies and entertainment are among the worst offenders. Now, I actually studied animation and film at BYU. And in our design classes, we are told that fangs and claws and scales are dangerous. And that is reflected and superimposed on our design language. And we normally superimpose it on our fantasy world villains. Okay? Which of course reinforces our socially acquired fears of nature. But more than pop culture, so you start to see how they all stack up. But more than pop culture, my mom's also afraid of snakes because when she was a young girl, her brother used to catch snakes and throw them at her. Now, that real trauma is not the fault of any snake. Again, it's human behavior that is responsible for her fear, and her ultimately misdirected fear. Now, she's definitely not alone. I don't know if you guys knew this, but during the period of westward expansion in the 1800s, people would move west to settle where we live now, and they would contract anthrax from their cute, cuddly cows. You guys know what anthrax is? Terrible bacterial infection. And they would develop these grotesque and sometimes life-threatening necrotizing sores. All right? And guess what animal got the blame for those? It wasn't their cows. That's right. Specifically, rattlesnakes, even though they had nothing to do with the illness and nothing to do with the sores. All right? So we as human beings are kind of perpetually guilty of misdirecting blame. All right? Again, I remind you, it's an election year. Tomorrow is an election day. All right? Misdirected blame is everywhere. And we do it to people, and we're even worse at doing it to animals like snakes, bears, and spiders. So let's use one of North America's most notorious spiders as an example. In 2005, a survey was conducted to see how well Americans could identify brown recluse spiders. 1,773 specimens were submitted, but less than 20% of them were actually brown recluse spiders. And the survey authors actually found 38 other arachnids, many of them not even spiders, that even pest control professionals and medical professionals were misidentifying as brown recluse spiders. As it turns out, spiders and subsequently spider bites are among the most misdiagnosed ailments in our culture, even by pest control professionals and medical professionals. And even the spiders that we fear most are typically nowhere near as dangerous as people think they are. So, for example, brown recluse spiders. Only 10% of their bites generally require medical attention. Would you guys believe that? For those of you who have heard about brown recluse spiders? And they're typically and it's typically isolated to a blister near the bite site. All right? And the bites are almost never fatal. The New England Journal of Medicine has actually listed 40 different ailments that are misdiagnosed as brown recluse bites all the time. And they range from fungus to poison ivy, bacterial infections, and pressure sores. But brown recluses get blamed for all of them. All right, now there's a good reason for this. If any of you guys get injured or have an illness, how many of you would prefer to tell somebody that you got a bacterial infection or you were bit by a spider? All right, to put it in context, let's say you go to a party and you go in with a bandage on your hand, and somebody walks up to you and says, "What happened to your arm?" "Well, I picked up a flesh-eating fungus somewhere." Or would you prefer to say, "Well, I was minding my own business with the family at the lake and a spider came up and bit me for no reason"? All right, one of those, the spider bite is a more socially acceptable explanation for a lot of the ailments that we suffer. Now, in case you're wondering, brown recluse spiders do not occur naturally in Utah, as much as people like to claim that they do. In the extreme southern tip of Utah, we do have desert recluse spiders, but again, extreme southern tip, they do look like brown recluse spiders, but they are not considered to be as venomous. If you see a brown spider around here, pretty much guaranteed that it's a wolf spider, a hobo spider, or a grass spider, all of which are completely harmless, actually beneficial. All right? Now, if you do get bit by a recluse, get some medical attention, okay? But don't panic. Chances are you're going to have a sore for a couple of weeks and a pretty good story to tell later on, because people like hearing about spider bite stories. So what about black widows, North America's most venomous spider? I caught this one along with several other ones in my yard this year. All right?
They just scare the pee-willy out of me.
So then make sure you pay attention. So the National Institutes of Health conducted a survey of over 23,000 confirmed black widow bites. These are confirmed black widow bites between 2000 and 2008. Only 1.4% of bite recipients developed life-threatening symptoms. 33.5% developed moderate symptoms that did require medical attention, but 65% only suffered minor side effects. All right, as it turns out, North America's deadliest spider just is not that deadly. Now, I'm not telling you to go out and start playing with black widows. All right? But if you do get bit by one, again, go to the hospital. But if you're in good health, chances are you'll have to endure a few minor side effects. Okay?
And for goodness sake, just wear some gloves when you reach into the wood pile.
Also good advice. The thing is, like black widows, they actually have been proven to be very docile.
Yeah.
It's only when being pinned that they typically will bite. Again, in self-defense. All right? So we've talked about bears, we've talked about snakes, we've talked about spiders. Let's talk about big bad wolves. Now, perhaps no animal is cast in our fantasy villain role more than wolves. And now that wolves are repopulating a lot of their historic range over the last 30 years, and a lot of us have images of Little Red Riding Hood's grandmother being eaten alive instilled in our minds since childhood, a lot of us are very afraid of these long absent predators. So a few years ago, I set out to separate wolf fact from wolf fiction. I covered potential threats to people, livestock, and game animals. I interviewed ranchers. I interviewed wildlife biologists. I interviewed wildlife managers and public lands managers, reading study after study and every single wolf attack that I could come across. and ultimately published my findings in a 4-part series on KSL. Now again, unfortunately, we don't have time for me to go through the details, but if you're interested, these are the articles.
This is where I learned about your work.
Is this where you learned about my work? My findings angered quite a few people. Even though I didn't set out with the conclusion already in my mind. There are a lot of people who fear that wolves are a great threat to us as humans, to livestock, and to game animals. But the data just doesn't support it. Now, I will admit that there is some nuance to this conversation. Again, that we don't really have time to discuss today. But the main takeaway is that of North America's large predators, wolves are probably the least dangerous to people. Okay? In the last 100 years in North America, there have been approximately 20 attacks, far fewer than any other large predator in North America. And only 2 of those attacks have been fatal. Again, far fewer than any other predator in North America. And like bears, I have also been extremely fortunate to have some remarkable encounters with wolves in my travels. This one's one of my favorites. I was again in Yellowstone National Park, watching wildlife, and I spotted this herd of bison. This is at the end of the gallop, but they were stampeding on the far side of the valley, which sometimes means that a predator is nearby, and I located this wolf, who realized that he really had no chance of taking down a bison all by himself, and so he starts wandering down the valley, ultimately stopping just across the river from where I was standing, and began to howl. Now, like countless other wildlife encounters, I was reminded that wild animals are neither angels nor demons. All right? They are at times powerful, beautiful, wild, and unpredictable. And for a lot of us, that makes them scary. Especially in our modern technological age. We tend to fear those things that we can't control. Measured fear, appropriate fear, is what I would probably call respect when it comes to the outdoors. It can be a very valuable tool, all right? So it can sharpen your focus so that you're paying attention to what you're doing. It can prevent reckless behavior, very valuable. And it can encourage you to seek understanding. Whereas unmeasured or irrational fear, like social conformity, can and does sour and metastasize, and can lead us to act in ways that actually only make our situation worse. Okay? So remember Kendall Cummings, the guy who got into a fist fight with a grizzly bear? All right? Well, it definitely took some serious guts to get into a fist fight with a grizzly bear. Had Kendall just understood that the bear itself was attacking out of fear of him and fear of his friend, who was actually the first one attacked. They all had bear spray, but nobody used it. Had Kendall just used the bear spray that he carried with him, he would not have received such grotesque and gruesome injuries. And he would have been far better able to help his friend, which was his initial purpose to begin with. In a sense, humanity is becoming like this man, hysterically swinging a bat at nature and unintentionally harming ourselves in the process. Now, simply put, nature is not our enemy. Nature is our ally, and we best serve ourselves by protecting our natural resources. Now, I think it would shock you if we were to list all of the eco-services and benefits that nature provides humanity free of charge. And that includes marvelous services that are produced or provided by quote-unquote scary animals. Large predators like bears and wolves have actually been shown to have a remarkable influence on the health of our forests and our waterways. Who here has had water today? That water comes from our forests and our mountains and is directed here. You guys know that national forests and wilderness areas were not set aside because they were pretty. They were set aside to preserve our access to water. Snakes help us manage rodent populations and help decrease the spread of disease and the depredation of crops. Their venom is also unlocking revolutionary treatments for human ailments from arthritis on up through cancer. Spiders are a mostly self-regulating creature. They prey on each other, And they also prey on other bugs, which helps us manage other invertebrate populations.
They're our allies against the blood-sucking insects.
They help us in that as well. But more than that, so their venom is equally valuable in the treatment of lots of diseases, but their silk is actually being used as gauze and antiseptic cloth that is increasing the success rates of skin grafts and wound care. Did you guys know that?
No.
And then there's billions, if not trillions, of unsung heroes, like Utah's more than 900 native pollinators, all of which are endangered because of our destruction of their habitat and our overuse of pesticides and herbicides. Now, if we're going to turn things around for our benefit, we need to replace our unjustified fear and misdirected fear of nature with understanding and respect. The solution is to leave our controlled spaces and to learn how to spend quality time in wild spaces. And that's really my work. I seek to empower people to spend time reconnecting with the natural world and feeling at home amongst nature.
All my walls are covered in words, and while you sleep, I mark my goals. Stand tall, think clear. Don't let them see a hint of fear. Lines and dots, zoom in, zoom out. Open your window, let them hear you shout. Right on the poles, right on the street. Always remember the future is near. Cut some cords, scratch some scars. Put on your cape and jump from the car. Open your mouth, take a deep breath. Run fast and don't stop at the edge. You can be anything you want. You can be everything you choose. Do not let it slip away. 'Cause if you never try it, you never know. You can be anything you want. You can be everything you choose. Do not let it slip away. 'Cause if you never try it, you never know. When I was a kid, my dad used to say, don't let anything stand in your way. Stand tall, think clear. Don't let them see a hint of fear.
My number one hope for today is that our time together has helped peel back a lot of misconceptions about nature and provided some liberating perspective on our relationships with the world around us. There's an incredible world of opportunity, growth, understanding, and excitement, and even hope for the future for people who overcome their misdirected and socially acquired fears of the natural world. Thank you.
So does anybody have a question for Mike? We've got time for a couple questions for sure. Okay, go.
You talked about like fangs or claws or things like that, like somehow being like naturally scary to humans, and that's just kind of interesting because it's like, why is it those specific things? Like, is it like sharp, or like what is it that causes a human mind to think that that's dangerous or scary?
You know, there's a lot of thought on this, and people are still debating it. A lot of people just think that it's inherent in the human existence to see things that are potentially harmful as inherently dangerous. However, I mean, I know small children that are scared of vacuums. Okay, for example, my son. I think it's just fear in general is something that is a self-preservation mechanism. And then we acquire a certain cultural understanding as life goes on that certain things are more dangerous than others. Which is a little ironic. I don't know if any of you guys saw it, but there was an article from the Park Service, or the Park Service is requesting that people not lick toads.
Oh, I saw that.
Did you see that?
I saw that. Don't lick toads.
Yeah,
What?
don't do that. Toads don't have fangs, they don't have claws, but they secrete toxins. They're dangerous. It's dangerous to lick certain amphibians, not something that should happen. Anyway, I hope that answers your question.
Who else? Anybody else have a question? Go.
What about the animals that got like rabies? Like that's kind of like what about them?
Well, that's a good question. Should we fear the animal or the disease?
Yeah, but I'm just saying they, I don't know. Yeah,
Well,
probably the disease.
if they have rabies, it's gonna kill them, right? And
But they usually they attack people though.
Yes.
Yeah, so an animal that has been infected with rabies, their brain is literally decomposing
Yeah.
inside their skull, all right? And that causes them to behave more aggressively, to lose their fear, okay, but also to have seizures, all sorts of stuff. It's not just about attacking people. It's about the deterioration caused by the disease, okay? So, again, it's the disease that is removing that natural barrier of fear that keeps both wildlife and people at a good distance and a safe distance. But, I mean, it's really uncommon for you to come across an animal that has rabies. If you do see an animal that's foaming at the mouth and behaving really erratically, like shaking and having seizures, yeah, back up, get out of there, and notify either the Forest Service, the Park Service, wherever you may be. They can come and take a look for the animal.